Okay, welcome back from the afternoon sessions, which I hear in part were overwhelming, to put it lightly. But we're going to hear more of them from Rob, Joel, and Simon. So if the three of you would be so kind as to come up to the stage. Okay, thank you for volunteering to give us the highlights of the individual sessions. Joel, if you don't mind.
Sure. So our session was on modeling policies, and the idea was roughly to sort of divide it in half and first show how we model policies and how policies are modeled in PERICLES, and Stratos took us through the linked resource model and sort of some recap of stuff we talked about yesterday, so the basics of what an ontology is and how it works. And Fabio took us through an example of video playback that they had previously done in another workshop, modeling the policies. We recapped a bit of a discussion we had yesterday about the benefits of modeling policies, about how it can help to simplify our understanding of the sort of complex and detailed preservation actions that we're taking, and how they can help us do impact analysis. So if we're going to change from one policy to another, what's the impact of that, and how do you manage the change of that? How do you validate policies? So if you're saying your preservation systems are you're trying to preserve something in a certain way, how do you know that that's actually happening? How do you think about compliance and things like that? And then we, Jean-Yves took us through, one of our examples that we've been working with at our factual recently is email archiving. We looked at some examples of policies from how we used to do it a few years ago and how we're looking at doing it now and how some of those has changed. And Jean-Yves took us through how that was modeled did a demo in Protégé, which is an ontology tool to show how that policy was modeled and how you could see the impact of that. And I think it's fair to say that the tool is kind of small on the screen and the ontology subject is pretty complex, and so there was a fair bit of wow, there's a lot of stuff there, reaction. But then we got into a bit of a discussion about actual email policy. So we sort of took a bottom-up approach and looked at typical things that we do at a detailed level when you're preserving email content. You do file identification, or you do normalization, or we extract attachments and we do virus scans. And looking at some of those and having a discussion about, so what of those things are just, they're just processes or they're low-level technical operations, and what of those are things that we care about that we want to kind of lift out and say, there's an end to this. So to give an example, we talked about extracting attachments. You don't really extract attachments. It's not an end in itself, but you might, one of the reasons you do it is because you might want to make sure you're using the right virus scanning tool on all of those attachments, and you want to remove any malware from your collections. And that kind of outcome is something that you might want to model as a policy. So then, and that was it. We sort of had an interesting discussion about that, and kind of talked about that from the sort of two approaches of taking that bottom-up approach of looking at all the detail of what we do, and saying what if that's kind of what's important to know about, what would we care about knowing that we're complying with, and that sort of thing. Or versus a sort of top-down approach where you could just start with very high-level principles about it's important to be able to prove the provenance of your collection, which is a very high-level generic statement, and what are the things you would do to enact all of that. I think that's about it. Does anyone in the group want to add anything to that?
Or does anybody have a question? Curiosity question? Yes, Clara?
This is just a very pardon my ignorance of the resources that, and I wasn't in that session, but I'm very interested, and I wanted to know, is there a tool that has come out of Pericles or a particular resource that would be useful for people who want to go through that exercise themselves?
So I think there's a couple of answers to that question. So we came at it from a particular perspective, which is in Archivematica, we already have a simple form of policy. So we have a lot of format policies about, so a certain format is a good preservation format or it's not. And that drives a lot of basic workflow. So we kind of looked at this when we looked at Pericles and sort of said, they're doing all this stuff about modeling policies, and we think that has a lot of use already in Archivematica, but there's a whole bunch of other things. So we came at it from the perspective, how would we go from where we've started with? So we sort of jumped straight to how do you model those, and looked particularly around the tooling, around the ontologies and Protege and so on. And absolutely there's tools to do that. Protege is a well-known, very old Stanford open source tool for modeling ontologies, and you can kind of get right in. That's exactly what Jean-Yves showed us. It's pretty intimidating, I would say, if you're not familiar with the subject. But I'm aware that another partner in Pericles, which I haven't looked at, kind of did a fuller set of tooling and actually did a policy editor, which is a little, I think the intent is to be more accessible and a bit more like the format policy registry in Archivematica, which kind of hides the technical details behind it and just shows simpler constructs of rules that happen. And I think the idea of the policy editor is to show something closer to natural language, the same sort of thing. So the other question that came up in the session that's sort of related to that is, I think there's a lot of benefit to just thinking about policy compared to the detail of what you do for lots of reasons in terms of understanding your processes, compliance, sharing them, that kind of stuff. A lot of the example that we went through was this impact analysis and change, and like kind of building on the whole digital ecosystem model. So I think the other question, which to be honest with you, I don't really know the answer to, is do you have to do the whole ecosystem model and use all of the tooling that Pericles has done to use policies? And I think our view is not that you should be able to take the pieces from the ontologies and so on, but I think you need to know about ontologies to take that approach.
Perhaps, I don't know, Fabio, you could add something to that?
Maybe I could simply add that also the ontologies in Pericles are structured in a layered way, so it's possible to adopt just the layers one wants to. So there's a design pattern for policies, which is very small and probably the easiest path to adopt the policies. The digital ecosystem model is richer, so it's possible to go, I would say, in steps and decide depending on the use case, basically.
Yeah, for sure. And we did talk about, because going through some of the ontology is very expressive and powerful. I mean, you can do amazing things with it, but you don't have to use all, it's all optional. So you can we did talk about how some of the properties and relationships, you could just ignore and just start with basics and then extend that over time.
Any other question or contribution? I think so. Well, thank you, Joel. Wrapping that up. Rob, would you give us the highlights of your session?
Yeah, so I looked after the session. I didn't do much in it myself. But the session on can we apply the Pericles modelling approach to shared infrastructure? We had a particular example from sort of pioneering colleagues in the Netherlands who they have a plan to bring together all 450, I believe it is, sort of repositories, memory institutions in the Netherlands who have to worry about digital preservation into a network with a view to shared services, cost savings, and sort of value add from the network effect, which, as I say, is wonderfully ambitious. So we split into sort of two halves, essentially. First of all, we got a presentation from Marcel, Joost and Tjaarda on the network in the Netherlands, the model that they developed, which is a layered model based on sort of standard business modeling, but applied to the particular repository network that they have, and identifying the individual services, blocks, pieces of infrastructure, business activities in a layered way, which makes the problem look eminently tractable. Of course, the devil is in the details of what's in the boxes. And then Tjaarda demonstrated this use in a particular use case. They have the Amsterdam Digital Cities initiative. And that sort of segued neatly into presentations from Johannes and Anna on the ecosystem model that Joel mentioned, and some of the tooling, the eco-builder tool in particular, about how you could, we've tried to create a tool to enable you to build up a model of exactly this sort of infrastructure without having to worry about the details of the ontology until you get to a certain level, and then with any sort of ontology modeling there comes a level where the detail becomes really quite extensive. But what we discussed is the approach that we've applied in PERICLES and we think would be eminently applicable to the Dutch Digital Curation Coalition case, is you model things at a high level to start with, and you don't need to add the detail until you need to add the detail, until you have a reason to do it, until you have a set of questions that you want to ask, and then you need to model in more detail. But if you can capture everything at the high level, and the key thing about this sort of distributed infrastructure is the entities that you model. You've got 5 boxes. Those boxes are individual organizations with their own internal structure, their own policies and politics, and the connections between them are technical, sure, but they're also service level agreements, there may be contractual issues on top of that. There's a whole series of complicated dependencies which in principle you can model. And if you can connect them all together really quite soon, you get to a level where you've got a few boxes and several connections, and you've already got something useful in terms of planning. Like if I change the policy here, then actually that's going to impact those 3 organizations there, which I didn't think it would. So once you can apply the discipline of modeling, connecting things up, as a planning tool, we think it could be very useful. But also as a sort of what-if scenario tool, is that if I change that, what happens? If this breaks, what happens? I spoke a little bit about how in PERICLES, for smaller systems, we've been able to couple some of these sort of these model experiments, if you like what if this breaks, actually to running processes. You have an execution environment, a test bed as we call it, which enables you to actually play live. If I change this model will actually drive a process. It'll tear down a Docker instance, it'll install another Docker instance. A different version of a system, suddenly you can see in action what actually breaks when you play with the model. So, so bringing all that together, we wrapped up with a session which could have been longer. We could have gone on for several hours, where Anna stood at the board, and we actually tried to take a particular use case that NCPD have of the proceedings of the Dutch Parliament are recorded on video now. The National Archives of the Netherlands has a legal responsibility to store those videos, but they don't know how to do it. And so a separate institute for sound and vision in the Netherlands actually does that, under service level agreement from the National Archives. And we had to go at modelling that on the flip chart. And actually, just with a few lines, we already sort of teased out some interesting possibilities. So, and we came out with a concrete outcome. Okay, we actually came up with this at coffee afterwards. But Marcel and I reckoned there's some use case here we can take forwards between us. We can apply some of the... PERICLES has an extension, which is handy. And we reckon this will be a really interesting use case to try and model in anger and see how far we can get, say, just with the digital ecosystem model to start with, without bringing in any more detailed ontologies. Can we actually get a model, maybe of a corner, maybe of the whole thing, and see how we can get modeling these dependencies? So that was a concrete, there's more work to do, I suppose. We gave ourselves work to do, but it's really interesting work. So that's kind of where we finished.
Thank you, Rob. Well, at least coffee was not for nothing then. That's such a good outcome.
Coffee at conferences is always
it's always the best. Not necessarily the taste, but the results.
That's
But they have nice coffee here, you must say. It's not water, brown water, as you can find sometimes in the UK. Anybody, any questions? Sorry. Italian coffee lover. Any questions to Rob or Marcel, for that matter? I don't know if he's there.
Direct to Marcel and Justin.
No? Okay, then we move on to the session that Simon was chairing.
Okay, so this was a session on what we call proactive management. So by proactive, we meant creating or controlling a situation rather than just responding. And the idea was to think about, really to ask people, how proactive are you in managing your content versus being reactive? So we were thinking in terms of the complex objects we're talking about in Pericles, dealing with change and thinking about, do you react to change when it's occurred, or are you more proactive? We had 3 presentations. So I presented something about the work on technical appraisal in Pericles, which was about measuring environmental risks, predicting environmental potential risks to your content, and then using dependency modelling to work out what's the impact and what potential recoverability actions. We had a presentation from George Papastefanatos from Athens on change management in database systems. So he was looking at what's the impact of change on a database, how can you visualize that, how can you try and deal with those kind of changes, and he had a nice visualization, graph-based visualization. And then we also had Tomasz Miksa from Athena-Research and Vienna University of Technology, who was talking about validation of scientific workflows, and he demonstrated how you may have a minor change to the software, one of your libraries in your system, that could have the result that your results are slightly different. So there's kind of sensitivity to change, and how do you validate changes you've made in the ecosystem. So one of the things we noticed first of all, straight away, was that there's quite a lot of commonalities in our approaches. We're all kind of using some kind of dependency type models. We've also looked at how do we visualize the impact of change, measure the impact of change, and validate those changes. So there's quite a lot of overlap, quite a lot of synergies. That was very interesting. Then we moved on to the group session, the group discussion session. So the first question we asked was, are you proactive? How many people are actually proactive now? And I think the general view of the audience was that most people put things in a repository, and then they realise that someone comes along and says, I can't use it anymore, then they have to do something about it, rather than being very proactive and actually working that out, trying to work out what things are reusable. So, I mean, there's maybe an implication that people are storing a lot of things which are not usable anymore. And also, the actual people running the systems are not that aware of what things are usable and what are not. And there doesn't seem at the moment to be effective kind of tracking even of what people are using or able to use, let's say. So then we so we then said, well, who's actually capturing software? Who's actually capturing things beyond just say documents? And it seems like there are people it seems like it's an emerging thing that people are actually capturing more software with experiments rather than just, they're capturing obviously publications, data, but now that people are actually moving on to capturing software. So we saw this as an area which is kind of growing in importance. There was a question about responsibilities of archivists versus researchers. So to what extent we can force or encourage, let's say, people who are generating data producers, to produce their data in such a way which is more resilient to change. So there might be an example, say, that you get everyone in science to use Taverna, because Taverna you can take the workflow out and you can capture all the components, and then you can archive them, and then someone could come along later and put them back in again and rerun the workflow. But we realise actually that's not really realistic. Also in software-based art, artists, people like galleries don't have a lot of control about what artists produce and what tools they use, and very often people, in both cases, there's a battle between innovation and maintenance, and most scientists, most artists are more interested in innovation than perhaps thinking about maintenance. So rather, we thought that actually trying to provide people tools which would actually capture the environment that things are done in, and capture sample data in order that you've at least got that understanding of what they did. and rather than trying to force them to use specific tools. I think the discussion was quite technical, and we did lose some of our audience at the midpoint. And so then we had a discussion about why did some people leave.
Talked directly behind their back.
Yeah. And we thought, I think we thought that perhaps some people are not dealing with these complex objects, so that's obviously a reason. And also that this is a bit of an emerging area, so dealing with software is perhaps, a lot of people perhaps are dealing with documents and they're not so interested in software, and it's not so much in current practice. But also, what we also thought was that it's quite difficult to do. So dealing with software objects, they're perceived as being highly fragile and quite difficult to manage, and there aren't really any tools out there to help people. So that was, maybe people didn't think they had a really pressing need to do that. But we also thought perhaps a bit about research data. That was a few years ago. That was a situation that no one really, all people cared about was publications. No one really cared so much about the data. Now people are really, since the funders mandated that people have to keep data, that everyone's worried about that. And you could imagine that in a few years' time, the funders might say, well, yes, well, people might say, well, we've got the data, but we still can't really validate if the results are correct until we have the software. Which is, I mean, that was a situation with publications, that you couldn't validate a publication unless you had the data, and then you can't validate the results of the data unless you have the software. So I could imagine a situation in a few years where people are forced to keep the software, and then there will be demand for this kind of technology. So we actually thought it was probably something which was emerging and will be needed in a few years. We discussed some of the problems like availability of libraries, and perhaps that may be the first cause that software is not going to work correctly if you take it out of an archive. And obviously over time, then you may get to a situation where much of the software is not available. Then you may get to a point where you have to just rewrite things. But rewriting, it seems like a really drastic option. And kind of whatever you do with software, if you're trying to maintain it, if you're trying to test it, it's expensive. So what's needed is sort of good prioritization. So you want to prioritize your efforts on the things that you need to keep working, and at the time that they need the action performed on them, before it's too late. Otherwise you will get into the situation of maybe just having to rewrite stuff. There was an important point made that even if people say researchers have access to software for doing things like running scientific experiments, that may not be sufficient for people to actually understand and interpret the results. They also need good documentation. They need to know what all the data fields mean. So actually, dealing with the software part is part of the problem, but also then people also need the additional information about what the data actually means. And the kind of implication of bad practice, I mean, someone actually said that they were thinking perhaps not to accept, if people didn't think they could actually, archivists didn't think they could actually preserve things, then they would perhaps say, well, perhaps we just don't accept them. They just won't last. So maybe that's also going to be a driver for people to actually, or motivation for people to actually do things in a more, write things or produce things in a more reusable way. And at the end we had a discussion about exploitation. So how would we presented results from three EU projects, 3 research projects, and we said, well, how do we, what's the value for the community? How are we going to translate those into actual products? And I think at the moment we're still perhaps exploring this space, but we thought there's currently a lot of work in the community on data management plans. So Tomasz talked a little bit about those, and and also being able to automate those, and that may be a kind of a driver for this kind, integrating this kind of technology where you have a cross-community effort, which may eventually result in these kind of tools being in some sense mandated, that people are mandated to produce their software in a certain way. They're mandated to capture environmental information and so on, which will help with preservation of more complex objects. So I think that was all I said. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. I've been in that session, so I can judge. It was a very good summary. Thank you. Has anybody any questions about this topic? William.
Maybe this isn't the time to do it, but I would be interested to know a little about the kind of legacy planning around Pericles. And I have kind of vested interest because the DPC is a kind of vehicle for the sort of, how to describe it, the sort of kind of nurturing of projects after the end of the project, so to speak. And there's such a big investment and such a great enthusiasm and such a great skill brought to the work that you're doing that we do need to find ways to make sure that, you know, the project is dead, long live the project, whatever the right phrase might be, that there's value that we can continue to give from the work that we've heard about in the last 40 years.
I mean, probably Christine's probably better qualified than me to talk about sustainability work. But certainly we're making a lot of the tools we're available as open source, so people can continue to develop them. We're developing a portal. I think maybe Christine.
I like to describe that. You know, we have an approach that defines roles that need to work together to achieve something, and we have found tools already there that we use in a testbed, and we have some that we have invented, developed as a placeholder for that role. Might be another tool in 5 years, but luckily we have an extension of 2 months, so we have time, which is usually lacking, to wrap up and really communicate now that we have the final picture. And we're doing this in different ways. We're going to write a white paper, which we're going to communicate widely. The tools are going to be placed on Preserveware, which as a tool, as a portal, we're also going to promote and hope that other people will join, because it will only be strong if there's a lot of links to other tools or tools themselves on it. But I think one important thing is what Rob and Marcel also, we were doing this anyway, but with Marcel as a use case partner, that would of course be lovely, to work with the testbed, to describe it more, to place it in a way that it is reconstructible in the future. If I may say it that way, or Rob, you probably describe it better than me. So we'll have a testbed where you could run it, and it's described. We're going to try a couple of other scenarios, but perhaps just Marcel as a more important one. We'll see. White paper and the tools and general promotion. And of course, this conference was at least trying to seed the ideas, even if we don't provide you with many names of the tools. I think it's important that this model-drivenness is in your heads, and you'll understand it more in the future. Well, thank you, the three of you, and my special thanks go to William, and I think you will appreciate, just as I'm appreciating it, that he will do the closing words for us. But before he does, I have to thank him, because he won't do it himself. Thank you very, very much, and thank you to DBC to having helped us organize all this, to have it made it possible for us to have it in this wonderful, wonderful venue, and to have it linked to, of course, the wonderful ceremony yesterday evening. So we really, really appreciated this possibility. Thank you very much.
So Christine's asked me to say a few words by way of wrap up to today and to this part of the conference. We've got another day to follow tomorrow, which I'll say a bit about in a moment. Pericles, a Greek statesman, noted general and orator. It's very surprising to be invited, therefore I feel my oratory will not quite reach the golden age of the Greek Republic. So let me pick out a few themes for me from today in particular, but also from the last couple of days. And I want to start, Matthew Addis, are you still with us? Matthew's presentation this morning, The Power of the Many. I want to think on that for a moment or two. So, in a project or in a program of a conference like this, associated with a project, it's striking to identify those themes which we are making progress on, and those themes which we hear a lot about, which remain on the agenda. And there are certainly some things we're still arguing about in the digital preservation community. We're still arguing about OAIS. 20 years that's been going. We hear about experimental test beds. Heard about a little bit of that today. We've had experimental test beds in digital preservation. We've heard about risk management, a recurring theme. We've heard about ecosystem capture. You can tell which workshop I was in this afternoon. And we've talked about environmental, for example, Angela Dappert's work around environment in the context of premise. So there are themes that we continue to work away on, and it's good to see the progress associated with those. But you might ask yourself, what's new? You might ask yourself, what's new? And I suppose, well, there are many, many detailed things we can say which are new in the context of the work that's been described, and all of that progressing and all of that moving us forward. But let's return to Matthew's observations this morning. What's new? What's new? Well, what seems to me to be new is the many. And I know Matthew's very thoughtful analysis identified how few we are. How few we are against the millions producing data. How few we are against the billions of devices producing data. How the Internet of Things means my fridge is going to have a larger digital footprint than my parents' generation in total. We few. We band of brothers. That's to say, 10,000 people. 10,000 people. Now, some of you will remember way back to conferences like the Cedars Conference in York, 2002, I think it was. Andrew Wilson, I think you were there. There was one or two others, probably Nancy, one or two others. And at that meeting, no, it must have been about 2001, it must have been earlier than that, because at that meeting it was proposed that what we need is some way in which all these disparate and small and fragmented organisations, the 20 or 30 people from around the world that could be brought together on the topic, could find a way to discuss. And what we really needed was some sort of coalition to work on digital preservation. Because it was the only way to keep that very fragmented and small group of people in conversation. We few. The 10,000. What can we do with 10,000 people? This is an extraordinary turnaround. We ask ourselves what's new. What's new is, for me, more than anything, the many. And let's think of what that means. We think about sharing infrastructure. We talk about sharing infrastructure at a technological level, and much of our research and development, rightly, is on the sharing of infrastructure at a technical level, of course. But know-how is infrastructure, and people are infrastructure too. And to be successful in the sharing of our technical infrastructures, it seems to me self-evident that we share in that infrastructure of people and the infrastructure of know-how. Let me observe my favourite line from the West Wing, when he's got his, what do you call it, the auto cue prompt in front of him with the spelling mistake. And Bartlett announces to the expectant nation that together we are stranger. Together we are stronger. Let's think about Nancy's three-legged stool, again mentioned briefly today. And I've been thinking for this on a while, and I've been trying to think, how do we pull these strands together? Are we, to go back to Tim Gollins's question this morning, are we computing scientists learning about archives? Are we archivists learning about computing science? Who are we? What are we doing? Are we computing first? Are we archives first? Are we technology first? Are we data creators first? Are we access first? What's the priority here? In the language of the three-legged stool, organisation first, technology first, resources first. What should it be? Well, all of us first. That's what I'm going to propose. All of us first, because we all need each other to support this ongoing development. Even more so when we consider the proposition that Matthew gave us on our need to engage with the many and bring their insight and their working practices into line with our needs. Let's think, I'm going to give you my favourite throwaway line from this morning as well. It cracks me up. I have to say it in a Glasgow accent. And I can't remember where it came from. It was either Tim or it was Matthew, but it was in that little brief dialogue they had between each other during Matthew's, or at the end of Matthew's wonderful keynote. Matthew, I think it was, described the IT industry as big, hairy incumbents. What a fantastic insult. You big, hairy incumbent. I can see Billy Connolly saying that. And that makes me think about change. It makes me think about change. If there are incumbents, then there's some sort of status quo. And actually, implicit in that slightly strange insult is a sense in which you know, there's a status quo that needs to be turned over. Are you with me? And we think about acting on change. Change is here to stay. All of those slightly paradoxical aphorisms. Well, I suppose I've come at this maybe from completely back to front way. I've been thinking, how can the digital preservation community cope with change? How can we cope with technological change? The big, hairy incumbent comment makes me realise that we're not victims of change. And if we are to make a success of this, we in this room, we the 10,000, we should be the agents of that change. And that's our charge, I think, leaving the meeting today. And tomorrow we meet again, and tomorrow is our day of workshops, the eye of the storm, preserving digital content in an ever-changing world. And I'm going to become all sports psychology on you now and tell you to be the storm. Be the storm. Don't be a victim of the storm. That's all I wanted to say by way of wrap-up. I'm not sure if that's in any way useful, but I suppose I should move more formally on to the thanks, which I've got a few thanks to make. And I'm going to look at Christine and make sure I've not missed anyone on this. So let's start with the formal thanks to our sponsors, to the European Commission under our FP7 programme, and also our generous hosts here, the Wellcome Trust. I think we should give them a round of applause, at least for the purposes of the record. Move on to thank the organisers. In particular, let's break that down into 2 or 3 kind of groups. We should thank Edwina and her team of microphone runners and all sorts of services which have been provided at the registration desk, all wonderfully, supremely, effortlessly presented to us. And we all know that when things look effortless, they require an enormous effort. And I think we should recognise that and thank that team very much, but not before we also thank the organising committee, which it was my privilege to be part of. Christine, Mark, Pip, John, Linda, and have I missed anyone? I fear I may have done, and if I have, I offer my heartfelt apology. So thank you to the organising committee, and let me especially thank Christine. It's not probably worth sharing too much, but there were moments we had quite a lot of work to plan the event, especially at the start, get it off the ground properly. We had lots and lots of discussions, but we knew what we wanted to do. And we overcame the challenges that we had, and we did it successfully. And that is therefore not simply about being good at the subject matter, it's about being an exemplary co-worker and collaborator in this endeavour. So let me thank Christine and her colleagues for their patience and endeavour and foresightedness and encouragement through the development of this conference. And I want to add a footnote, and again, I've lost track a little bit of where she is, but the initial conversations between the DPC and the PERICLES conference came from some early discussions with a member of staff, I think at the Tate at the time, Katerina Hage. She was a friend to the DPC during the 4C days when she worked at the National Library in Frankfurt, and I think she's on leave. Is that right? There was at least one child born in the PERICLES project that I know of that people are owning up to. So we should, I think, for a moment, just thank Katerina as well for that initial spark of putting us together and helping us to achieve this, and then to finally thank you all for your contributions and for the discussions. I have to say, I looked at the programme, especially this morning, and saw that Natalie Harrower had the job of running a 2-hour plenary discussion session. Man alive, that's a devastatingly hard thing to do if the audience isn't in a position to participate. But I'm afraid Natalie didn't even get halfway through her questions. And that's not an apology really to Natalie, it's a compliment to you all for your eager and interested participation. So shall we leave it there? We shall leave you with your charge not to be victims of change, but to be agents of change. Thank you very much.